As we talked about early on with Jay's treaty, part of the reason that the United States was so upset was the fact that the British were still supplying the Native Americans along the Western Front with weapons in order to fight the American settlers. And Americans continued to settle west in the Northwest Territory despite the fact that the Native Americans were protesting. And because of the supplies by the British traders, the Native Americans eventually began to attack violently and start war between them and the settlers there. Early Native American victories were under the command of Chief Little Turtle, who was very instrumental in organizing the Native Americans together and attacking the Western Front. And many of those early victories that the Native Americans won were due to his leadership. The United States sent General Anthony Wayne to lead the U.S. troops against the Native Americans, and eventually, under Wayne's command, the U.S. troops were able to defeat Little Turtle and his men at the Battle of Fallen Timbers. And from that final battle, we created what's known as the Treaty of Greenville, which officially ended the war between the Native Americans and the U.S. settlers in 1795 and gave the Americans most of the Native American lands in the Northwest Territory. It also guaranteed the safety of the citizens who were living there under the parts of the treaty. And finally, Native Americans received about $20,000 and acknowledgement of land, a small portion of land that was supposed to be still held by them. In addition to what was going on in the Northwest Territory, in 1791, as part of Hamilton's plan to pay off the debt, Congress passed a tax on luxury items, one of those items being whiskey. And people in Western Pennsylvania grew very bitter about the tax that was placed on the whiskey. They were already upset that the federal government had not done enough for them to protect them against the Native Americans. So now with the whiskey tax, they really were on the verge of violence. Farmers made whiskey from corn, right? It was corn whiskey because it was much easier to transport whiskey than transporting those ears of corn. Also, cash was rare along the Western Front, so whiskey became like money in that region. So it was a very important part of everyday life to the farmers out west. Protests in 1792 began to make Washington create a proclamation that laws had to be obeyed. Even if you didn't agree with them, you may not agree with the whiskey tax, but it was a law that was passed and you still have to obey them. Protesters began to refuse to pay the whiskey tax, and they began to tar and feather tax collectors all along Pennsylvania and other western states, and violence began to spread throughout the states, and this was soon known as the Whiskey Rebellion. Eventually, Washington actually personally led the army to stop the rebellion, and the farmers surrendered right away once they knew that Washington and the U.S. troops were actually coming their way. So it was not a very long-lived rebellion or one that actually started at all. But what it did was that it proved that the United States government was supreme and it would use force if necessary if the people did not follow the law. Right? It reestablished the supremacy of the national government, the fact that once a law is passed, even if you may not agree with it, you can protest, you can do everything within your rights, but it does not give you the right to not follow the law. Now, Washington leading the U.S. Army to stop the Whiskey Rebellion is actually very significant because it's the first and the last time that a sitting president personally commanded an army, right? After the Whiskey Rebellion, no other president after Washington would actually command and lead an army out into war or any type of battle after that. And of course, for safety measures, one can imagine why that would not be a good idea if you had your president leading the army into war in case something happens and then you lose the president because of that. So with that ended the Whiskey Rebellion and it reinforced the supremacy of the national government.